Thanks for joining. We'll get started with the webinar in just a minute, so sit tight and we'll be with you shortly. Thanks for joining. My name is Cassie Rowe, Content Marketing Specialist here at 451 Research. Today's webinar, Voice of the Service Provider Differentiation Strategies, and Vendor Partner Preferences, will be presented by Al Sadowski, Research Vice President here at 451. Before we dive into the content, I just want to give a brief introduction to 451 Research for those of you who aren't familiar with us. 451 Research is a top-tier research and advisory firm headquartered in New York City. Our team of more than 100 analysts cover more than 2,000 technology vendors and service providers every year. 451 Research provides unique insight into emerging disruptive technologies and the companies taking them to market, and deliver that insight via syndicated research, advisory services, and live events around the world. Voice of the Service Provider provides actionable insight into the infrastructure-based service provider economy. Through quarterly surveys and in-depth interviews with a curated global service provider panel, 451 Research's Voice of the Service Provider helps to both qualify and quantify buying behaviors, business drivers, and strategic priorities for the expanding universe of public cloud providers, hosters, MSPs, Telcos, system integrators, SaaS companies, and colocation providers. Voice of the Service Provider is designed to support strategic business initiatives for technology vendors and infrastructure service providers. In short, you can essentially use it across your business, whether you're in product marketing, product management, marketing, corporate development, and sales. Before I turn it over to Al today, I would like to settle few housekeeping items. The webinar slides can be downloaded in the attachments and links section of the BrightTalk platform, although we will be providing an updated version after the webinar is concluded today to account for any blank spaces due to animations within this presentation. You can also submit questions to the presenter, to Al, in the same platform for the Q&A at the end of the webinar. And this webinar is being recorded and will be available immediately after today's session. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Al.
Thanks, Cassie. I first want to thank you all for making the time for today's webinar. We have tremendous attendance, looks like from all around the globe. Whether you're here from a hardware or software vendor, just seeking insights into the service provider channel, you're a member of the investment community, perhaps a service provider looking to see how you are stacking up against your peers, or an enterprise just trying to understand infrastructure trends, welcome. I'm excited to share insights, so let's get going. Okay. So this is not my kids fighting me over the last Reese's Peanut Butter Cup from Halloween, but I think what this represents is a metaphor. I started out 5.5 years ago at 451 Research as an analyst covering the service provider space. And at the time, service providers were all battling each other. At the time, SoftLayer was still an independent company. Microsoft Azure was still called Windows Azure at the time. Google Compute Engine wasn't even GA yet, and Oracle's CEO was, I'd say, pessimistic about cloud, and VMware's CEO said, any workload that goes to the commodity public cloud it would be a loss. We've seen a barrage of press releases over this time and briefings that I took at the time where there was a lot of discussion around how service providers were different, talking about price reductions and things like that. 451 actually has something called the Cloud Price Index. It's very similar to the Consumer Price Index. We started it in 2015 to track the relative price of public cloud via a basket of goods, just like the Consumer Price Index. And you can see here the prices have come down since we started across all different regions, some more dramatically than others. This is not a sustainable model for a number of providers. And we have seen some pretty public exits from the public cloud. Hewlett-Packard Enterprises, HPE, was in the public cloud business. Runs a very successful server and storage business, supplies many service providers, but it didn't find success in the public cloud. Verizon had a number of stops and starts with different architectures for its public cloud infrastructure, and ultimately decided it was not going to be a winner for them, and even sold off a majority of its data center assets to Equinix. And then there's Rackspace. It realized it wasn't going to compete head-to-head with the likes of the commodity public cloud providers on price. It tried to highlight its services capability and white glove support, and ultimately had to transition away from putting resources in its public cloud product to more focus on private cloud and managed services on top of other clouds. So this is today. This is what we are seeing today as far as service providers. There's a lot more partnering going on. There's a lot more managed services integration with the public cloud providers, and then with tier 2 and tier 3 providers. We've seen AWS and VMware become strategic partners. We've seen Rackspace and other managed services providers adding Hyperscalers, managed services capabilities. And a big driver of this is hybrid and multi-cloud management. So another one of 451 Research's products, Voice of the Service Provider, or Voice of the Enterprise, has a panel of enterprises. We ask them questions, and we ask them enterprises about what their plans are over the next 2 years as far as where workloads are going to be deployed. And 68% of enterprises are going to have multi-cloud or hybrid cloud. Now, hybrid, for our definition, it's a single business process that may be taking place across a number of venues, but it's all seamlessly integrated versus just running an application in one cloud, a different application in another cloud, which is multi-cloud. But 68% of enterprises plan to have something other than just a single cloud. So this is a big reason why vendors are paying a lot more attention to service providers. Enterprises are outsourcing a lot more to service providers, and one of the main catalysts for why we launched Voice of the Service Provider. So what I'm going to do with the balance of my time, I'll take a very quick second to just give you a high level about the product. I will recap some of the findings from Q1 that actually tee up some of the work that we've done in subsequent quarters. I will share some of our 2Q findings. That's why you're all here. And as Cassie mentioned, we'll leave some time at the end for your questions. So Voice of the Service Provider. If you start in that bottom left-hand corner, what is a service provider in this context? So it is a managed service provider. It is a public cloud provider outside of the hyperscalers. There are Colos who are starting to now become public and private cloud and managed service providers themselves. It's SaaS companies. it's system integrators. And now for the case of SaaS companies and system integrators, the ones that are in our panel are going to be ones that own and operate their own infrastructure versus being an asset-light company that is basically born on top of compute and storage and services from one of the public cloud providers. And then there's telcos. We have panelists across, 1/3 of the panelists are from the US, 1/3 from the UK, and 1/3 from Asia. Specifically, we're focused on India and China. This is a senior audience. These are people who drive product roadmap decisions, influence budgets, things like that. They have to be at least director and above, and there's companies from $1 million all the way to over $1 billion in this panel. And each quarter, we have a different theme. We conduct at least 20 in-depth interviews, and we do at least 225 surveys across this panel, and each quarter is a different theme. The first quarter was infrastructure evolution. I'll go into a little more detail on that. The second quarter, which I'm going to focus on today, was how service providers are differentiating how they feel about the vendors that they're selecting. The third quarter, which we'll be publishing within the next couple weeks, is about budgets and spending, and the fourth quarter survey is workloads and key projects. All right, so the first quarter, again, that was infrastructure evolution. This really teed up the thoughts and the kinds of questions we asked in the second, third, and fourth quarters when we talked to service providers. So here we got a sense for their customer pain points, what their own technology challenges are going to be, a general approach for how they work with technology suppliers, what they're going to do about IoT. We asked about a number of technologies, whether it was the chips-based servers that they're going to use, their interest in hyper-converged and various software-defined capabilities and open compute and blockchain. And then we also asked where they're currently offering services and where they plan to geographically expand, and that's stuff we covered in the first quarter. This report was published in May. If you're interested, the executive summary for this report, if you're not a client, a subscriber of Voice of the Service Provider, you can get a copy of the executive summary, the table of contents, by going to the 451 Research website. So one of the key takeaways from the first quarter was that 77% of the service providers require some form of transformation of their own business in order to support their customers. Now, if you think about it, as far as those business imperatives and what digital transformation requires and what that means to the service provider and with the impact to them. So this would be leveraging customer data and applying machine learning to create intelligence. It's the agility, deploying DevOps models and using APIs and containers, adding automation to create that agility. And transformation is also building those customized experiences for a B2B or B2C customers. It's now top of mind for enterprises and for service providers and for the vendors who are selling to them. So I'm going to just leave you with a couple of just high-level data points across compute, networking, storage, and then I have one for Colo as well. So as service providers think about their next compute purchase, we ask them, hey, what are you going to do next? And 30% of the service providers said that they're likely to consider public cloud for the next compute purchase. There's a keen interest among service providers of moving towards OpEx spend rather than CapEx spend. In the case of networking, 52% are going to use generic x86 hardware and SDN when they are deploying network services. And this is probably a big reason why companies like Cisco are evolving their business models to do more and more with software. And then finally, in the case of storage, 24% are interested in converged and software-defined configs. I suspect when we run this survey, question again in the first quarter of 2019, that number will be even higher. So that's compute, network, and storage. And then just real quick on data center capacity. There's a number of people on this call from the Colos space and companies that help them build data centers. And we asked the question about when you run out of floor space or power capacity in the data center, what are you going to do? Now you'll notice this is kind of an odd organized list, and the reason is that these are organized by OpEx versus CapEx, and clearly you can see that service providers favor OpEx solutions when they run out of data center capacity versus CapEx. They're not racing out to build new data centers or buy new data centers. They are going to focus on expanding space they already have, utilizing third-party resources, and actually in some cases looking to leverage the public cloud and use compute and storage and other services resources rather than stay in the real estate business. All right, so that's a real quick recap of Q1. So now I'm going to go into Q2. So in the Q2 survey, we focused on how service providers are differentiating. As you saw, 5.5 years ago, they were all fighting with each other, and now they're all trying to figure out how they can work together. We ask about where their top customers are coming from today and where they will be coming from, what they think about the hyperscalers, which is interesting. We also ask about their preferences for vendor attributes for compute and storage and colo and private cloud management software, and their likelihood to retain those vendors when their purchases are going to happen next. And we spend a lot of time asking about the vendor partner programs. Vendors are increasingly spending time trying to understand and recruit service providers into their programs. We quantify the reasons why a service provider is interested in a hardware or a software vendor's program. Ask a lot about their procurement and sparing strategies, what their thoughts are on the current SLAs and warranty satisfactions and things like that. But just in the interest of time, I'm only going to focus on a handful of these. So I'm going to focus on the competitive differentiation, those top verticals, the hyperscaler relationship. I'll give you an idea of what we are doing as far as the vendor attributes and likelihoodness, but only for storage and colocation. And then I will focus some time on the reasons why service providers, what they're looking for out of a partner program. So this report was just published in August. Again, it's available on the 451 website if you're not a subscriber to see the details of what's in there as well. So when I first started as an analyst, and before that I spent 20 years in the telco space doing product development, product management, and I had cloud strategy for a while on the Colo product management function. But when I started as an analyst, what service providers would talk about as far as differentiation often was focused on price and geography. Now, clearly, as we fast forward to today, price and geography are not winning strategies for most service providers. All of the hyperscalers are now all over the globe. They have the economies of scale as far as pricing's concerned, purchasing power. So it's tough to win a price battle with a hyperscaler. So instead, what service providers need to do is focus on the quality of their service and the technical support capabilities. And in fact, that's exactly how they are differentiating now today, as that's their top point of differentiation, followed by just service reliability. If your services aren't performing, if you don't have the availability, you have public outages and things like that, that's not going to help your case. So if you're a service provider, how does this data help you? It shows you what your competitors are doing, and it shows you perhaps areas where you need to focus your attention for your value prop, your marketing, And if you are a vendor that's selling to service providers, you should be thinking about how you can support service providers as they look to become more reliable, where they're trying to find technology innovation and things like that. So the next thing that I wanted to focus on is just where their customers are coming from. So the dark blue represents where service providers are suggesting their top 3 verticals are for their customers today. And the lighter shade of blue is where they think those customers are going to be coming from in the next 12 months. And off to the right, across the 4 different regions that we focus on, these are the top verticals. So probably not a surprise in China that government is the biggest vertical. In the United States, healthcare is at the top of the list. A lot of focus there. And again, as a vendor looking at this data, you want to make sure that your products and services help the service provider ensure that they're going to be compliant with specific industry standards and requirements. And if you're a service provider, to make sure that you're marketing to the right organizations. So you see at the bottom here, when we ask the question for which of the following capabilities are you partnering with a hyperscale cloud provider, you would think that in the past they would pretty much all be saying we do not partner with a hyperscale cloud providers, but I'm sure you can sense a theme here that that's not the case. 86% of all the service providers that we surveyed have some sort of relationship with a hyperscaler. Now, a lot of them may just be simply offering connectivity services, whether it's Express Route or Direct Connect. They might just be providing managed services on top of existing hyperscaler capabilities. But we're starting to see an increase in service providers that, instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, are building in capabilities that already exist into their own applications. So whether that's machine learning functions or serverless functions, or perhaps the service provider is offering a DR or backup capability and they're leveraging one of the hyperscale public cloud providers to assist in providing that service. You also see, as I mentioned before, about hybrid cloud is a big catalyst. Service providers are actually building their own orchestration software or capability to do hybrid cloud management. So out of all those services that I just showed you on the last screen, we ask them, okay, great, you're doing all these services, who are you doing it with? Probably not a surprise to see Amazon Web Services at the top of the list. 55% of the service providers have suggested that they are partnering with Amazon. But there's a lot of other ones they're also supporting as well. Microsoft Azure runs a very close second with the service providers. And if you think about it, a lot of these service providers grew up as MSPs, and they had existing relationships with Microsoft. Perhaps they had existing relationships with IBM or Oracle as well. And that's why you see the partnerships across the board here. Google at 36% is relatively new as far as trying to pursue enterprise workloads, and suspect these percentages to rise. And then Alibaba, again, this survey was 1/3 US, 1/3 UK, 1/3 Asia. So across the board, it didn't fare so well because of just landed in the US recently. But again, there's a lot of interest across the board for service providers to provide more of its capabilities by leveraging hyperscalers. And then we asked So what happens over the next 2 years? How do you see your relationship evolving? And we broke this down across the service provider types. So either there's no change, which is the gray, they expect to partner more, which is blue, or the lighter blue, expect to compete more. You can see here Telcos, for example, are expecting to partner more. And you can see where other cases, generally speaking, a third of each of them expects to actually compete more. But it's a relationship where service providers need hyperscalers in order to perform some of the capabilities. They just don't have the resources in-house to do it themselves. Again, from a vendor perspective, it's important to note how this is going to evolve. So I included this slide not to show you the back of my head or to just point out the strong SOC game amongst some of the panelists there. But this actually is a historical picture in a way. It's the first time ever in the history of panel discussions or SOCs that Microsoft, AWS, and Alibaba shared the stage. And we spent the time talking about the benefits for service providers to partner with the hyperscalers and become part of their partner networks. So we talked about not only what's in it for the service provider, but what's in it for the hyperscaler themselves, and also what's in it for the customers. And we expect to see a lot more of this partnering to be happening in the future as well. This took place at our Hosting and Cloud Transformation Summit. It happens every September, and it'd be great to see some of you guys there next year. Okay, so we talked about the relationship with the hyperscalers. We talked about how service providers are differentiating, and now I have a couple examples of what service providers are looking for from their technology partners. So if you are a hardware provider or a software provider or a services provider looking to do business with service providers, these are the attributes that they're looking for from their technology suppliers. Probably not a surprise to see product performance and features at the top of the list. Reputation actually is an important capability. They don't really care about your strategic vision. Long-term viability is not top of the list, so that is good indication for some of the smaller companies and startups in the space that there's an opportunity for you as long as the capabilities that you're bringing and the performance is there. In the case of storage, I broke out storage for you as well. Again, we did this for compute. We did it for public or cloud management software as well. In the case of storage, it's a slightly different story. That still requires your product to perform, but feature differentiation is important. If you're just doing what everybody else is doing, you don't stand out in the crowd. A lot of service providers are formulating relationships with people that they have done business with historically and will continue to do so. So you need to stand out. Customer service and support are important. It's important for the service provider as a capability of their own for their customers, so they expect that same capability from their vendors as well. The strategic vision in this case is also important. And then interesting, where reputation across the board generally for service providers is important, it's not so much the it's not that it's not desirable, it's just not one of the top decision-making criteria for storage provider. So if you're a storage provider, what you should be able to take away from this is where you need to focus your attention in the case of value prop and marketing and sales when you're talking to various service providers, and making sure that your products resonate with service providers based on these attributes. And then there's Colo. So in the case of Colo, just about 80% of the service providers were using some form of Colo. And we asked them, hey, what's the most important selection criteria in the case of a Colo vendor? And as I pointed out earlier, service providers are not going to be building and buying data centers. They're going to be looking to third parties, whether that's colocation or cloud resources. But your data center needs to be reliable, have that uptime capability, product portfolio breadth, and connectivity options. That is a big concern for service providers, making sure there's network access variability for diversity purposes. But we also asked them why didn't they pick the second choice. So they narrowed it down to 2. Why didn't you pick number 2? And connectivity was a big reason. Network performance and reliability. So again, focusing on the network aspect it should be something that Colo providers should be focused on. And if you're a network service provider, working with those Colos to make sure they have the diversity and that performance and reliability will help them as well. So what we do in our Voice of the Service Provider product, the advisory report, there's a lot of interesting graphics. There's a lot of key takeaways that we provide. But we also, if you can only do one thing on each page, and that's read 1 or 2 sentences, we provide our take. So here's just an example for when we talked about the Colo provider selection process. So our take is very succinct, and we do this for across the whole report. Service providers want uptime, security, connectivity options, not the fancy bells and whistles when it comes to selecting a colocation provider. So providing virtual reality capability to see inside their pod of the data center, not nearly as important as having a robust portfolio of network connectivity options. So over the last 24 months, some of the key reasons for making a change. Slightly good news, and perhaps the way you look at this, glass half full, glass half empty, but 41% of the service providers have not changed vendors in the last 24 months. So, perhaps good news, but that's also saying that 59% of them have changed a vendor in the last 24 months. And here's the reasons why. Cost, lack of partnerships. So again, getting back to that discussion earlier about the need for partnerships, whether it's with a hyperscaler or whether it's with a hardware or a software vendor. And we'll get into that in a minute here. But also being able to provide customer support and just the product portfolio perhaps just didn't have enough of what they were looking for. So as a vendor on this call, or a vendor that's a client of Voice of the Service Provider, the takeaways here are making sure that you are addressing these concerns. Okay. Next slide. All right, so partner program requirements. We asked this separately about hardware and software. And what we point out here is that pretty close to all service providers are a partner with both hardware and software vendors. And what you can see here is what they want out of a partner program. Whether they are talking about a hardware partner or a software partner, training is key. Being able to influence your product roadmap is key. Help with go-to-market plan development is important, especially in the case of on the hardware side. But if you think about it, the top represents what the providers want, and in reality, what vendors are actually offering them is stuff that's towards the bottom. And I've talked to a couple of different vendor partner program leads and validated, and they, you know, they agreed, and it's something to think about. So if you're a hardware or software vendor partner program owner, or you collaborate with one, this is an important thing to bring back. The service providers, it's not about access to marketing dollars and exposure at events as much as it is to some of the things at the top. So it's a little bit reversed here. So an opportunity for hardware and software vendors to go back and rethink their partner program highlights, you know, what they want to focus on. Those, not saying that those things aren't important, but there's other things that are even more important. So move training up to page 1 of the slides that you share when you are pitching a service provider, for example. Okay, so the last data point from the second quarter data that I wanted to share is about automation. Now, I mentioned before with transformation that service providers are looking to do a lot more with need to do a lot more with automation. Now, I haven't published the third quarter data yet, but it's pretty obvious when you look at the results from the third quarter that there is a plan amongst service providers to increase their spend for automation of their infrastructure, whether it's their on-premise infrastructure, the customer premise infrastructure, or third-party infrastructure across the board. So something to pay attention to. But to break this down even further, in the second quarter, so all this blue is good news for software vendors that sell automation software. But the key is not just trying to sell this through the C-level executives at the service provider, but forming relationships in the operations and development organizations with specific team leads and things like that. Those are the ones that are trying to automate compliance testing, doing orchestration of containers, or just generally automating infrastructure configs and deployment, and also introducing CI/CD into the environment. But again, these are the people to win over in this space are the developers and operations people. So as a vendor, good news for those who sell automation software. All right. So there's a wealth of other topics that we covered in the second quarter. Just in the interest of time, I'm not going to be able to get to all of them. But as I did with Colo, we talked about some of the primary compute and storage vendor requirements, the likelihood of somebody purchasing from their current vendor. We get into the contract terms for hardware and software and their satisfactions with SLAs and warranties, sparing strategies and provisioning intervals, and also, especially for hardware vendors, a lot of questions about on-site services and pro services, whether they're day one or day two services, service providers' appetite for purchasing some of those capabilities. So a lot of interesting insights that are available there. So now we're going to head on into the questions section. But before I do that, I just wanted to give you a sense for what's coming next. So I mentioned third quarter was about budgets and spending, and this is going to be published within the next couple of weeks. So we asked service providers to break down their budgets across compute, storage, networking, data center facilities, software, third-party cloud services, and personnel, what that looks like today and what that looks like 12 months from now, and some of the reasons why. We ask, why it's increasing, why it's decreasing across a number of those categories. We ask about the supplier mix. Are you planning to introduce more? Are you going to consolidate across a couple of strategic partners, things like that? And then we dove into their IT organization. A lot of them are specialists where they have storage specialists separate from compute and virtualization and security and a number of different categories, and we ask about their interest in becoming more generalists, especially with the advent of hyper-converged and x86 commodity, x86 hardware, and things like that. So we quantify some of that, and also where they're going to increase and decrease teams across a number of different categories. And then we ask about some of the emerging technologies. A lot of buzz in the marketplace about machine learning and AI, and there's an increase in spend going to be happening there, and we talk about that. Same with edge computing and 5G and hyperconverged and a number of other categories. So that's what's going to be published soon. And then in the fourth quarter, workloads and key projects. So this is where we're trying to find out what are they going to be doing next, and not only what are they going to be doing next, what's under the hood. So if they are offering backup and DR, did they build something on their own in their own data center? Are they leveraging the public cloud to do that? Are they taking software from Veeam or Cohesity or Zerto or somebody like that to make the product happen? If they're offering relational or non-relational databases, which frameworks are they going to be supporting? Or if they're doing data analytics, which visualization tools and things like that? Or in the case of SD-WAN, which hardware vendors or software vendors are they going to be supporting? And then we get into some of the use cases and strategies around edge computing and machine learning. So not only if they're going to be offering some kind of machine learning capability as a service or built into their own operations, but which frameworks are they going to use? Or in the case of blockchain, what are the use cases and frameworks that they're going to use? Which, if they're going to be starting to offer VNFs, which ones? Again, helpful for the vendor community to know where the puck is going, so to speak, as far as service providers, and then for service providers, just getting a sense for what your competition is up to as well. So that's what's going to be coming soon. And then I'm just going to leave you, before we get to the Q&A, with just a couple of just last minute, just a few last things to consider. So in the first quarter, infrastructure evolution, I mentioned that 30% of the service providers are likely to use public cloud for the next compute purchase. In the case of this past quarter, differentiation vendor selection, 86% of service providers currently partner with a hyperscaler. So something for you guys to think about, just whet your appetite before the reports are published, but in that third quarter budgets and spending, 43% of the service providers are going to be expanding their third-party cloud management teams. Now, it probably makes a lot of sense with the desire for hybrid and multi-cloud across enterprises. Service providers need to figure out a way to support that. So they need to add resources that are experts in the various hyperscalers, for example. And then what's coming in the fourth quarter? It's a good question. I don't have any data. This is a survey that will be going into the field before Thanksgiving and something we will publish after the new year. But we are likely to see the amount that the hyperscaler influences the product and services that other service providers are going to be launching, whether they're going to be doing it in-house or whether there's going to be hyperscale under the hood. So that is the extent of my comments. So now we're going to get to your questions. Cassie?
Thanks, Al. Our first question from the audience is, based on the new FASB and possibly a subset of regulations, ASC 842, go into effect in January, where all leases must be reflected on a balance sheet, do you expect or are you hearing there will be a major shift to cloud services in 2019?
Yeah, so that was a mouthful of acronyms there. But yes, so whether we look at our voice of the enterprise data, which is focused on enterprises, and that's something that I talked about when I reviewed the first quarter data, we see a shift from on-site to off-site for workloads for enterprises, and that means they're moving to service providers. We also, from the voice of the service provider data, see service providers more and more leveraging the resources from colocation providers and from public cloud providers rather than building their own. So yes, there is a need for multi-cloud, and multi-cloud really, I think, might be overused in a way to represent what some might call hybrid, but multi-cloud, in a sense, is just using multiple clouds, and enterprises are using 3 and 6 and more different clouds, whether they're using a SaaS offering from one, or they're doing their some applications in AWS and others in Microsoft, and perhaps they have some back office software with Oracle and are now using OCI. So there's a number of multi-cloud enterprises that are using multi-cloud, and now service providers are trying to figure out a way how to be the managed services arm for those enterprises across those various venues.
Thanks, Al. Our next question is, information security is not mentioned much in this survey. Are service providers not considering cybersecurity as important? There's a couple other questions within this one question from the audience, but I'll let you start there.
Yeah, so I didn't include security in this particular discussion, but it was a topic in every quarter. We asked about which managed services that a service provider is offering, and we quantified that. There's actually a short form report that I published in the first quarter where we went out specifically and asked the hyperscalers included about a number of topics, and that report is available. And if that specific person if you have their contact info, we can probably actually send them that. But security was a topic in all the quarters. In the third quarter, around budgets, what's happening with the security teams and things like that. And then in the workflow and key projects coming up, security again is a big focus. What are those managed services that are specific to security that are coming? And security is one of the, and this is something that will be published soon in the budgets and spending, it's one of the higher margin services for service providers, so therefore it's getting more attention from service providers, and they're increasing their budgets for security-related services as well. It's the number one concern of an enterprise moving to the cloud, and it's the number one concern of a service provider offering services. And as far as their technology challenge, it's definitely a space that we're tracking.
Thanks. So the rest of the question was, BrightTalk did a little glitch on me there. The next question I see here is, can you speak to the transformation of business model service capabilities among service providers, including M&A activity? And do you have any research on this trend?
Okay, so I think one of the points to make here is that we are starting to see colocation providers become cloud providers. We see system integrators becoming MSPs. We see telcos trying to figure out what their role is in this space. Again, they had fits and starts with being public cloud providers, some more successful than others, and what their role is. We actually even see vendors themselves as providers. You can even make the argument that there are a number of enterprises that are service providers themselves. So the lines are blurring as far as what even is a service provider anymore.
Awesome, thank you. So looking at the next question, sorry, there's a bunch coming in here, Al. Do you have any data on growth of service providers versus public cloud providers?
Yep, so 451 Research actually has a companion product called Market Monitor, and Market Monitor tracks the market size for a number of different areas, and we get bottoms-up estimates from a number of service providers, and one of them is the hosting cloud managed services Market Monitor, and it tracks the growth rates across that space. So I guess the answer is yes, we have it. I don't have it handy in front of me, but it is something that 451 has. The interesting thing to point out there, as much hype there is for public cloud and infrastructure as a service, managed hosting is probably 6 times larger in terms of overall revenue than that space. So yeah, it's got a lot of hype, it's got fast growth, but it's still 1/6 the size of the hosting market.
You mentioned service providers needing to hire management teams related to use of hyperscalers. Can you share some examples?
So this would be, the examples here, and it could be a MSP, it could be a telco, it could go across, and even public cloud providers themselves. But the thought here is that there is a need in the market for multi-cloud and hybrid cloud, and enterprises don't all have the resources in their own staff to manage all that, so they're outsourcing to service providers. So the service providers are adding capabilities to provide that managed services overlay. Rackspace is probably a good example here, where they not only offer cloud resources of their own, they have a private cloud. They also provide managed services for AWS and Microsoft and Google. They have teams that are experts in each of those capabilities. There are other service providers that are doing similar, where they're bringing resources in to help provide the managed services for some of those other public cloud providers.
Thank you. I just wanted to make note that there are a couple questions coming in related to the IBM and Red Hat acquisition. We actually just posted a blog on our website if anyone wants to go and check that out. It also links to a report within our research dashboard that Al contributed to, which you're also welcome to take a look at and read. There's a bunch of things about rationale as to why that's happening and those sorts of things. But if, Al, you wanted to give any thoughts about that while we're live, you're welcome to.
Yeah, I think the blog and the report are pretty self-explanatory. There's a lot of commentary in the market about about what this does for IBM and the impact it has. A lot of discussion about IBM becoming an open source company, and I think the misnomer there, it's been involved with open source across a number of different areas for quite a long time. A founder across a number of open source communities. It'll be interesting to see how they integrate some of the Red Hat capabilities that may be in conflict with directions that IBM themselves have taken, but they haven't made a lot of those decisions because, quite frankly, the deal hasn't closed yet, so they haven't even been able to have those discussions. I would suspect some of the other Linux distribution companies are paying attention to how this works out, and I'm sure some of IBM's competitors are also paying attention as well.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So the next question I have here is, what is the impact of the hyperscalers in Europe versus the U.S. as it appears appears as though they have a larger impact in the U.S. Do you think this is true?
I would say that there is a lot more revenue in the U.S. amongst, was it specifically about public cloud providers? I believe. If you look at it in terms of revenue, there's more public cloud revenue in the U.S. than in Europe, but Europe is also going to see some growth. Brexit, GDPR, and things like that are catalysts. You're starting to see a lot of the hyperscalers provide their services from more and more regions within Europe. They're not just in the UK and Germany anymore, but they're expanding. There's a lot of data protection requirements that require deployment in various countries. So you're going to see a lot more in Europe as well as in Asia as well.
Looks like, question? Yeah, I think we have time for one more. We do still have a bunch of questions in here. I know a couple of you have follow-up questions based on questions you previously asked. I'll make sure that I get Al your contact information so he can follow up with you. And then any other questions we don't get to, I'll be able to see who asked questions and I'll be able to connect Al with you. You can also email him or tweet at him. His contact info, I believe, is in the presentation. So you can also follow up with him that way. Yep, there's the Twitter handle. So let's ask, could you please share an example where competition and partnership coexists between a hyperscaler and an MSP?
Yep, so think about the point here is that there are MSPs that have relationships with multiple hyperscalers. So take pick the system integrator or MSP at the top of the the revenue wise, and they most likely have relationships with all of them. And now when you think about an enterprise that is going to be putting out a RFP for a big cloud outsourcing opportunity, and they go to that big system integrator or MSP to be a partner, and that MSP has a group that is dedicated to AWS, or they have another group that's dedicated to Microsoft and another group that's dedicated to Oracle. They're now in competition with each other, so it'll be interesting to watch how that all plays out. Some of you may recall, Google has a mandate that 100% of its sales are going to be through partners at some point. I can't remember the time frame when they want to do that. So they're expecting 100% of their sales to be partner driven. And they have partners that are not only partners with Google, but they have partners that are partnered with their competition as well. So again, there's going to be interesting to watch. I came from the service provider space and launched a CDN offer from a telco with a partner, and actually we ended up doing it with two different partners, and it just caused a lot of channel conflict. The contract language with one of them was probably the most complex thing that lawyers needed lawyers to understand what it even said. But it'll be interesting to watch, but there's just a lot of overlap in the market from that perspective.
Awesome, thank you, Al. And I do apologize, everyone. We're going to have to make that our last question. We do have another webinar starting soon, and we want to make sure they have enough prep time, so we unfortunately can't go past noon today. But thank you very much for joining us. I'll make sure to get any unanswered questions over to Al, and we'll connect with you. Or you can still email him, tweet at him, whatever your heart desires to get your questions asked. If you could also, before leaving for lunch today, if you're on the East Coast, leave us some feedback. It would just help us improve our webinars for the future, or just give us some words of encouragement to let us know that we're doing a good job. But thank you very much again. The replay will be available very shortly, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you all. Thanks, Cassie.
Thank you, Al. Have a great rest of your day.
Take care.